we give it a little time for the intro song to fade down, and I can say hi there, everybody. My name is Jack Packard.
I'm Darren Mooney.
And with us this week is Will Cruz.
Hey, Jack, Darren, everyone else listening or watching, happy to be here. In case you didn't know, I'm part of the Escape History MR crew, but I'm also a film nerd. I got a degree for it, so I hopefully get paid off at one point. I don't know, but I'm glad to be here.
Will
and with that, Will becomes the most qualified person on the podcast.
Probably not.
Like, I've seen a lot of movies. Does that count? No?
That counts.
No.
Yeah, no, that totally counts.
No, hey, listen, episode at a time. We'll help chip away at that student loan. This week on the Escapist Movie Podcast, we are going to be talking about the new announced Wonka prequel. Whether or not it's a good idea, that might get into a little talk about the writer's previous work in Seth Rogen's An American Pickle. Then we'll segue over into the rumors and speculations that famous actor Chris Evans is returning in some fashion to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, possibly, but denied, but not, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we don't know. And then we will take a look at the stills from the Mortal Kombat reboot and have a fun little discussion about how we feel our standards as viewers have changed throughout the streaming years, and particularly the pandemic year, as we're all stuck at home watching all these streaming movies. Is it our standards that have changed, or is it the standards of the productions that have changed? Dun, dun, dun! So hi, and welcome. This is the Escapist Movie Podcast. Zee-doop-bop-a-doop-boop. Wah.
And this is how we're able to pay off Will's film critic degree. Because we skimp everywhere else, but the guest salaries are just up there.
Exactly. Just boost them up. All right. So first, the announcement that we are getting a Willy Wonka prequel movie. That's my feeling.
Was there a desire for this, or like who wanted this?
Well, you say this, but there have been rumors of this circulating since God knows when. And I mean, obviously, there was the previous Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory Tim Burton movie, which was obviously its own kind of prequel in that it gave us this completely unnecessary Freudian excuse for who Willy Wonka was, because you see, his father was a dentist, so he became a chocolate magnate. Because everything is Freudian, you see. Absolutely everything is Freudian. But yeah, so obviously you can trace the roots back to that. You can trace the roots back to the fact that, like, everything these days has to have a prequel or an origin story. I mean, even when you do reboots of established characters who have had an origin story relatively recently, I'm looking at you, Batman. You constantly have to, like, remind viewers of the origin story in case viewers might not get that the Waynes were brutally murdered in a back alley, and this explains Bruce Wayne's horrific trauma. So,
Wait,
I can
How many Waynes have died on film? How many sets of Waynes have died on film? The Burton Waynes have died on film?
The Schumacher Waynes as well, because they were a separate set when Val Kilmer had his flashback. Remember when he had the big red book? There's obviously the Nolan Waynes as well. One of them is Linus Roach. Then there's also... now, again, are we discounting animated movies? We should discount animated movies.
Yes, the live-action Waynes.
So then there's the Zack Snyder Waynes as well.
Okay, so we are up to 5 sets of Wayneses killed on screen.
The Waynes are on the wane, as it were.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
There's so many Waynes that have died now that I'm thinking about it. And I was like, damn, if we really put in the cartoons or even the animated movies, it's like every other time. Holy hell.
Have you guys watched Teen Titans Go to the Movies?
Yes.
It has one of my favorite gags in it, which is delightfully dark, is the sequence where they, like, travel back in time to prevent all the superheroes from becoming superheroes in order to allow them to get bumped up the chain of people getting superhero movies, which I love. It's like, we're so low ranking as kind of sidekicks that we need our heroes to stop being heroes in order to get movies. And, like, it's a big montage of them saving all these superheroes Darrow's parents. So like saving Hal Jordan's parents, saving Krypton, saving the Waynes. And then they realize that it still didn't work. So they travel back in time again and basically end up shepherding the Waynes down the alley. There's a shot of Robin holding a sign that says shortcut, pointing down a dark alleyway at night. And I love it. It's brilliant.
Yes.
But to bring us back to the Wonka discussion, because it's worth noting several things about this. First of all, people who are familiar with the workings of the industry probably had a sense that this has been coming for about a decade now. Because for listeners who are not aware, the Blacklist is a list of great screenplays that tend to circulate among agents that are not in production. They haven't been bought by studios. So typically a Blacklist screenplay is quite good. Everybody likes it, but there's no way that it's ever going to get produced. And it's typically used as a calling card for a writer. And now occasionally you will see screenplays on the Blacklist getting bought and bumped up and kind of made 3 or 4 years later. And in fact, when they do, it's frequently a selling point. It's like, oh yeah, this hot new movie of 2017 was a Blacklist script from 2011. So it's interesting that in 2014, one of the Blacklist scripts was Wonka, which was which was a script that was written by Jason Micallef. He wrote it. It's available online. You can find it quite easily. I've tweeted now from my own link, and and you can probably just find it with a quick Google. And you read it. It's a dark reimagining of the Willy Wonka origin story. Very dark. It begins during the Second World War. It's about him going off finding the Oompa Loompas. At one stage, he builds a giant chocolate palace for an Indian prince, and then the chocolate palace melts and kills everybody inside. And there's a long-running kind of Freudian feud that he has with the Bucket family, where it turns out that the owners of the chocolate factory that Willy Wonka bought were originally the Buckets, and the golden ticket scheme is an elaborate revenge plot for Willy Wonka to avenge himself on the children of his enemies. This was the 2014 Blacklist Wonka script.
What?
Which apparently agents loved it. Apparently agents were like, yeah,
How?
this is where the future is. This is where the future lies. Which is great. It's kind of like if you imagine Willy Wonka made by Zack Snyder. It's like you can imagine him literally saying, in my Willy Wonka movie, that chocolate smothers everybody. But yeah, the version that is being released is not that version, to be absolutely clear. It's not written by Jason Micallef. In fact, it's actually written by Simon Rich, and I have a feeling we'll come back to this. But it's been rumored, I think, for about 2 or 3 years, because it's been one of those projects where people have been like, oh yeah, sure, we've got this director and this writer signed to it, and everybody looking at it goes, sure, that's never actually going to happen. But according to like THR, for example, the director Paul King was actually signed to it. Paul King and the producer David Heyman. King is best known for directing the 2 Paddington movies, which are both sublime and amazing. In fact, Paddington 2 is the Godfather Part 2 of Talking Bear sequels. And David Heyman is best known for his work producing Harry Potter. So they've been attached since 2018. But what changed this week is that it was announced that a release date had been set, which is in March 2023. It had also been announced that there was a writer attached, which is interesting that, the writer is the last thing you attach to the project. And it was also announced
I love it.
that
Classic Hollywood.
Very much.
We got right. We'll write it eventually. Who cares about that?
Yeah. Least important part of making a movie. Am I right? And also it was announced that apparently Warner Brothers were, and I love the phrasing of this, Warner Brothers were looking at either Tom Holland or Timothée Chalamet to play the role of young Willy Wonka, which kind of implies that like they have no say in the matter. Like Tom Holland is just walking down Hollywood Boulevard one day when a black unmarked Warner Brothers van pulls up beside him and suddenly he's in a Willy Wonka prequel.
Can we as Hollywood just agree to leave Timothée Chalamet alone just for like 6 months? Just let that man sleep. I'm sure he's a lovely guy, but let him rest.
I don't know. Have you ever seen him sit down? I don't think he can sit down properly.
Oh, do you think?
If you're watching a Timothée Chalamet movie, make a point of watching how the dude sits. He looks like a man who cannot sit.
Oh, okay. Well then,
yeah.
I guess.
So maybe it's like helping him. Maybe it's like chronic insomnia.
They're just giving him something to do while he's shuffling.
Can we just acknowledge that there are more than 2 actors than Tom Holland and Timothée Chalamet that's within that age group or look that age group? Because I'm not opposed to either or. But there's only so much. I actually had this conversation with Casey on his podcast. We were talking about Chris Pratt. And I'm like, I don't have a problem with Chris Pratt. However, when I see his face everywhere, when he becomes the equivalent of The Rock for me, I'm like, I don't want it. It's just too much. You're spoon feeding me way too much of one person. And there is a pool of freaking ocean of actors who would love to be attached to something like this.
Specifically, someone like Chris Pratt, who is just like dude, just like white dude. Guess what, man? Just grab a hand in Hollywood. You have found a Chris Prattish white dude.
The statistical mean.
Funny.
Yeah, the statistical mean of like Hollywood actors, Chris Pratt. I mean, again, like, you know, I don't have a major problem with Pratt as a performer, but like, can we all agree he is the lesser of the Chris's?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Specifically for his life outside the performance, which we won't dip too hard into, but that makes him easily the least of the Chris's.
It's so funny because to this day, I still can't convince my parents to understand who's the difference between Chris Pine, Chris Pratt. It's always that guy, you know.
You got your Evans, you got your Hemsworth. Like, there's so many Chris's.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's fine. That's fine. We all like that. But so the big question here with the Wonka prequel.
Only one big question.
Only one. Well, the one big question is, like, what purpose does this serve? In the original Willy Wonka story, I suppose, like, Wonka doesn't necessarily have an arc. Like, you know, if we are to compare this to like a Star Wars, you know, Han Solo had his character arc happen in A New Hope. So we don't necessarily need to know what his life was like before A New Hope. Willy Wonka doesn't necessarily have an arc in the Chocolate Factory, and so it's conceivable that showing how he became an eccentric recluse could be interesting. Is it necessary? Absolutely not.
I'm now imagining, thank you for that, Jack, but I'm now imagining the scene where he gets the name Wonka, where he's like, Charlie, when you introduce me, can you call me Wonka? And it's like, no, I don't need that. I don't need that in my life.
Yeah.
Wait, what's your last name, Willie? I don't see a last name here. And he steps on like a clown horn, just Wonka. Oh, Wonka, that's where that comes from. It would be exactly that kind of bullshit.
That's the best kind of scenario. I was thinking more like if we're going World War II, East End London, it's like, he's a bloody wanker, he is. What, did you say Wonka? I said Wonka. Wonka!
I'm just, why? Like, I get it. An established property will get money. I understand that. But who was throwing their dollar bills and said, hey, you know what I needed? More Willy Wonka. I'm saying this, and if they come out with an amazing movie, I'm going to look very foolish. But I'm just trying to understand the drive aside from money, and also how is this going to fit? Where will there be the audience? Who is their key demo they're going for? And quite frankly, it's very confusing because... Yeah. If you're going prequel, it seems like you're almost aiming for an older demographic, unless I'm wrong. Because if you have no attachment to it, or, and I'm not saying older because if you watch the Tim Burton remake or adaptation, but like, I don't think, I love that movie. I don't think I would want to go to a theater to see this. This is something that if it hit Netflix, I'd be like, you know what? There it is. As to where people like would want to spend their money, I don't know. There's so many questions in my head. I feel special just thinking about it.
No,
I mean, the reason
ahead,
why
Dan.
is very, very simple. It's the fact that, like, back in 2005, the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory remake made nearly $500 million. So that's why. It's a mineable quantity. It's a known brand. People have, and like, again, and you could argue, like, going back even then, that was, like, what, 33, 34 years removed from the 1971 film. That has the same problem that we're talking about here, where there's a generational divide. And you're like, there's already a perfect Willy Wonka movie with Gene Wilder in it, and I watch it on television every Christmas. Why would I want to go see it? But apparently the answer is yes. Yes, people will go and see it. So I can imagine that being the pitch. It's like, yeah, we had these same conversations 33 years ago, Bob, and you know what? You were wrong then and you're wrong now. Get me Timothée Chalamet. And you can very much like literally see like who is the Johnny Depp of our generation, and it's like, like it's the same thought process in mind. It's like, okay, well, turning him into like who at the time was still a sexy young man with a very active young female fan base, tying him to an established property. It's the exact same playbook. Because it's very telling, as Jack pointed out, that like the writer is announced at the same time as the important stuff, which is that it's going to be Tom Holland or Timothée Chalamet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And yeah, that to me it speaks to like that's the age we're living in now. The age of the IP. We can't have new things anymore. Play with the toys that your parents played with because your parents are the one who are paying for the toys now, right? Which is terrible. But also like anyone. I'll say my age because I don't know everyone's age here, but I'm almost 40. So when in 2005 I was a fan of the original movie and of course the book, we all read the book in school. So I was a fan of the book and the original movie. When the Johnny Depp version came along, I rebelled against that because that wasn't my movie. It did very well. Mm-hmm. For the next generation, but now that generation won't like the remake because it's not their Willy Wonka, and I still won't like it because it's still not my Willy Wonka. So yeah, they keep Darren, that's so astute of you to point out that it's the exact same play. And why do these people still get to have jobs if they just redo what they did 20 years ago?
Well, the reason is $500 million at the international global box office, Jack. I mean, like it's not rocket science here. Like, I mean, I am not I know that Will likes the remake of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm not a huge fan of it, and I am very much a Tim Burton apologist. But like, if you're looking at it from like just a cold heart, nobody in this room cares about movies sort of argument that you tend to imagine takes place at the highest levels of a movie studio, because of course, it's like, yeah, this is a sane investment. This is very logical and very rational. And like, there are a couple of things about the pitch that I find interesting that I think are going to be interesting to talk about. So for example, I mean, we'll come back to the writer in a second. I will come back maybe to the director in a second. But just in terms of concept, because what little concept has been revealed, it's obviously not that pitch that I described to you there, the weird, super dark World War II, Willy Wonka kills two people on a boat, goes on the run on an island, builds a chocolate castle that kills people, and then it constructs an elaborate torture mechanism. It's not that movie, but the pitch seems to be suggesting that it will be covering his childhood in London, and it will also be covering his encounter with the Oompa Loompas. And it's like, I feel like if you're making a Willy Wonka movie in 2021, the part of the mythology that you least want to go both hands in on is the bit where Willy Wonka travels around the world, finds a tribe of indigenous people, which are maybe a little stereotypical, if we're going to be entirely frank, takes them away from their home, brings them into his factory, has them make chocolate where they never see the light of day, and keeps them a dark secret from the rest of the world. It feels like, maybe you're going to do something fun and interesting with that, but it really feels like you're playing with a hornet's nest, which is kind of interesting. I mean, maybe it will be clever. Maybe it'll be subversive and wry, and it'll pick at that. Maybe it'll actually be a story from the Oompa Loompas' perspective, where Willy Wonka is just this kind of monstrous figure who shows up and kind of corrals them away, and like just steals generations of them into whatever he steals them away into, because I'm not sure there's a word that applies without making it seem horribly tasteless.
I'm going to be significantly more cynical than you, and just I'm putting my money on white savior narrative here.
Oh gosh,
it's going to happen.
I had a feeling.
The Oompa Loompas are in trouble because they can't figure out this modern world, and only the European colonizer can help them out. Right?
So you're going with an Oz the Great and Powerful sort of thing here, where you take like the original Wizard of Oz is like a feminist text because it's a woman who blows in and she lands in this matriarchal society and men are impotent and powerless. Like the Great and Powerful Oz is just a bunch of smoke, and it's like, okay, you can read this story as a story about women ruling and women basically navigating their systems of power, and it's very clever in that sense. And then 2011. 2013, whenever Sam Raimi's Oz the Great and Powerful came out, it's like, I know how to fix this story. We'll take this story that was about a bunch of women who were very powerful and kind of independent and who ruled their own kingdoms and navigated their own political hierarchies, and we'll just drop a man in the middle of it and make him the most important person. And we'll explain how the fact that he broke one of these women's hearts is the reason that everything got screwed up in the first place, because, women, right? I mean...
That's great.
Right?
It's not great, but it's great. We've seen it a million times. And we're like, dude, what the hell is this garbage?
But I will say... Oh, sorry, yeah. Go.
I was going to say, this brings an interesting question, because I love the Gene Wilder, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I also was born in 94, so I had to think about how old I am. So I remember I have a fond place for Tim Burton from all his productions.
Yeah.
It's just always gonna be like that regardless. But the thing with the gaps between all of that, obviously, is just that the fact that those are stories we kind of know what to expect. There'll be twists and turns, yeah, but because we already had the plot, like we already had the archetype or the blueprint for the first one, we already got in the second. Now that we have a prequel, this just seems to be I'm still struggling to see where an audience can be formed, because unless this is the lightheartedest of lighthearted films, like almost Marvel Universal, like in that regard, where it can get to where it can get everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Where would this be? And kind of what Darren's saying, like, we don't need an origin story. The reason why the Joker is so interesting as a character is because we don't understand his background. Even in The Killing Joke, it's still a question mark of what happens. Mm-hmm. So for me, when I hear we're gonna give him a background and understand him in London, it's cool. And I guess you have to be a real super fan, but for me, there's nothing within that log line that captures my attention. And quite frankly, if this is gonna go and end up making like the absurd amount of money it did, or previous to what I'm saying to Tim Burton's, if it does anything along those lines, then I have to do a study, because there's no way. There's no one in my age group who needs this. There's no one within my parents' age groups who need this. This is confusing, and maybe I'm an idiot for saying this, but I don't know. Maybe Hollywood's trying to give us something that's like, oh, maybe you didn't know you need this. But in reality, we're like, no, we
Oh
we
yeah,
seem to
no,
be
this
like
is I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is them like looking at the numbers and saying the math adds up without actually being like in defeat of their audience. Where they're like, no, the math says you are gonna like a Willy Wonka movie. We did the flow chart and everything, and us viewers say, no, we're good. We're good. And not even to mention the fact that, like, you know, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory starts with Willy Wonka being a loner recluse. And so theoretically then you have to end his origin film on him deciding to shut himself off from the world. Yeah. Which is a super downer to end your movie on.
What I will say, though, is that like I think it's worth pointing out the talent involved here. And I know Jack wants to talk about American Pickle, so we'll do that in a second. Just a little bit. Like, just add a bit of flavor to our discussion, you know, kind of.
Little pickle juice.
Yeah. But what I will say is actually the director, Paul King, which is, he's a director who's obviously, he did Paddington 2, and those are, for my money, two of the best family movies of the past decade. And they are also the movies that when I heard they were announced, I immediately assumed they were the most unnecessary and completely useless. Where it's like, oh, we're doing Paddington, but it's going to be a CGI bear in a human world, and he's going to be voiced by Ben Whishaw. Doesn't Ben Whishaw seem a little bit kind of, you know, a little bit kind of like too kind of polished to play Paddington Bear? Doesn't that seem a little bit odd to you? And then I watched it and I was like, okay, I'm sold. I'm not going to say that it's the best movie Hugh Grant has ever made, but if you were to say it, I would not disagree with you.
Yeah, oh no, and so I guess we've been very negative on it,
Yes,
and a good movie. This is something that I've said a lot. I've said a lot here on the podcast. A good movie can be made out of any premise. The possibility exists for it to be good. Obviously, we've been very negative here. We've been very cynical because, you know, is it necessary to delve into the psyche of Willy Wonka? The answer is, of course, no. But there is some good talent. Both of the Paddington movies, I agree with you, having watched them with my children, are fantastic movies, fun for everyone. And the writer, the only movie I've seen of the writer, Simon Rich.
Yes.
Simon
American
Rich.
humorist. I think he's written for The New Yorker and places like that as well. Yeah.
The movie he wrote, An American Pickle, I watched recently, and it is a joyful, light-hearted comedy with some, you know, dramedy, maybe we could even call it. You know, some really good messaging, very fun, just a pleasant movie. So there is the talent there, but will the talent be able to usurp the IP from the producers is always the question.
Yeah. I mean, the gold standard here is probably the Planet of the Apes movies, the Planet of the Apes trilogy from last decade, because that was one of the movies where, and I remember it profoundly because it's like we're making a prequel to Planet of the Apes. It's like, oh, I remember the last time you did this, and sorry, it was another Tim Burton movie. And I say this, I love Tim Burton. I love Tim Burton a lot. It's just it's real shame that the movies that we're talking about are the two movies that we're talking about. But I was like, I've seen Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes. I don't need a prequel. It's like, but surely you need one starring James Franco, and I'm like, no, I don't. I don't need that.
Nobody needs that.
And I remember because I was lucky enough to see it before the kind of pre-release buzz started. I was one of the first critics to see it, which is always great when a film studio is like, hey, we want you to see this movie and we want you to see it early. It's like, that's really reassuring because it's very much when you see a movie like the morning of release, it's very much like, we got this done this morning and yeah, look, you can see all the handwriting is still there on the edge of the frame. But Cats was famously like, the version of Cats that was released in cinema was completed, I think, 12 hours before the world premiere. To give an example of that. But I did, and so, somehow it still got worse. But what I will say about like Rise of the Planet of the Apes was going to see it and being blown away, because I went into it and I was cynical. I was guarded. I had the same feelings about it that I have about Wonka. I was like, I don't need this. This is just a lame grab on an existing property that nobody in my generation cares about. Because obviously the prime Planet of the Apes movies are from the 70s. The Tim Burton movie made a lot of money but was terrible, and didn't exactly engender a lot of goodwill from audiences and critics. And I remember, and even the people involved, I'm a little bit like, this is the most cliche, handsome young man casting you could possibly have. And then going to see it and being blown away. Like literally being like, this is like, in the first 10 minutes going, is this good? And in the next like 20 minutes after that going, is this great? Like, and I like that's what I'm hoping. Like, I'm really hoping that like I sit down, I watch Wonka, and it's like, wow, Darren, you fool for doubting Warner Brothers and their spreadsheets.
Yes, and I mean, my short statement is just to agree with you. It's like I want to have room in my heart for that kind of hope. It's been a rough 4 years, though.
Yes.
This is where I'll throw an American Pickle in just to keep Jack happy. But no, that was one of the movies where honestly I had no idea I had no idea how well done it was. And I also just based off the trailer, I was just like, this isn't something I need in my life. And then really watching it over the holidays, and I was like, I don't think I've ever seen a Seth Rogen movie where he hasn't actually cursed or made the smoking jokes or going into his niche or what he's known for, and then laughing my ass off and enjoying it. So I think I've made this clear. It's like I'm never gonna want a movie to do bad, especially if you can blow me away. Like I told you about that Lockdown movie I watched recently, blew me away. I had no expectations. Rotten Tomatoes was dumped on it, and I was like, wait, I have no problem. I enjoyed what I saw. So if the spreadsheets and math proves me wrong, math proved me wrong. But for now, my skepticism is still there. My money is still guarded. And who knows? If it hits on HBO Max and I'm like, damn, I should have sold this in theaters. It happens. Who cares?
Wonka. They did it.
And I want to say, actually, American Pickle's probably a good indicator here, because like I think of like the opening 20 minutes of American Pickle when I imagine what a Wonka prequel should be like, which is the sequence where he's working at the pickle factory back in, the early 20th century, and he's like chasing rats with a big stick. But like, again, this is a very light spoiler for the movie because it's the entire premise of the movie. If you've seen the trailer for the movie, you know where this is going. But if you want to go in blind to an American Pickle, maybe skip the next 90 seconds of this. But he's basically, so this guy is working at a pickle factory. He's beating rats. Then all of a sudden, the rats gang up on him. They kind of press him back along the gangway, and like following that old early 20th century health and safety / Tim Burton, again, to bring Tim Burton back into it, Tim Burton Batman health and safety regulation. He's pushed back off a plank into a pickle brine where they're simultaneously closing down the factory because it's going out of business because the building's been condemned, therefore sealing him in brine and preserving him for all of time. There's a wonderful moment when he wakes up in modern New York And like it happens via voiceover, but the scientists are holding a press conference. And the journalists are like, you can't possibly expect us to believe that this man was preserved in pickle brine for 100 years. And then the camera like focuses on Seth Rogen's face as the scientist starts talking. And he just says, then the scientist said science stuff. And he explained it in great detail with wonderful logic. Everybody was convinced. And you just cut to the reporters going, yeah, it's a good point.
Oh, I guess it can work.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? And I think
That's the tone I want Wonka to hit. That's the button that I really want on Wonka.
And you know, like I was so concentrating on the comedy and the family aspect of American Pickle, I did kind of forget about the whimsy that movie has. There is like a very Wonka-ish feeling to the, especially the opening sequence of the movie when he's in the old country, when he moves to America, when he works at the pickle factory, and the way they are able to so deftly handle a situation like that, where it's like, here is a huge plot hole that makes no scientific sense. We're just going to call it out, but guess what? It's a movie, so it makes sense. Moving on!
I love the camera that pans to the graph and then pans back, and the reporters are like, yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Because the only thing that exists is the logic of the movie that it creates. Yeah, so yes, I will echo your sentiments that the whimsy that the writer has been able to create in the past gives me a small modicum of hope. But I'm with Will here. I need to see some math. I want to see some numbers. I want to see some charts, or put it on a streaming service that I'm already paying for, and then I'll watch it.
Would you go so far as to say that their math seems to be a bit wonky?
All right, I gotta leave, guys. It was a great time.
Thanks for coming, Will. Darren's scared away another one.
This is why we don't have a third host. We just cycle through recurring guests.
Because they can only stand Darren's puns, his brilliant puns for so long.
Yeah, eventually you reach Jack's level. It's just like Stockholm syndrome.
I'm here. I'm with you. I wish I could get to your level.
I think we call it the sweet spot. Because it's Willy Wonka.
Sweet spot. All right, well, let's move on. Mr. Chris Evans, most famous probably for playing Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four movies. Later
sense.
had some other Marvel movie roles. Hold on, I'm reading his IMDb now. Apparently, he was in later Marvel movies as a major character. Is rumored Captain
Jamaica?
Captain Aim Ricka. Captain Aim Ricka must be a deep Silver Age cut. He is rumored to be coming back in some sense to the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Making him Captain A.M. Ricochet. All
right.
Son of a bitch. Oh no, you're getting Will.
No, I'm here. I'm just mad that it works.
It's lockdown, Will. Where are you going to go?
Here's the thing, Will.
True.
They always work. Sometimes it takes you a little bit, but they always work. I don't think it's a spoiler at this point to say that the Captain America story, as far as the Marvel Cinematic Universe is concerned, was well buttoned up in Endgame. We know how his life ends now. We don't need any more Cap. And they are not only that, but the Marvel Cinematic Universe is starting to move on to the next phases. Obviously, coming up very shortly, we have Winter Soldier and Falcon, in which, much like in the comic books, Falcon takes over the mantle of Captain America. And so why are these rumors coming? Why does this exist? To me, like, the simple explanation is we know that Skrulls exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe now, and they're shapeshifters. And so much like his tiny appearance in Thor: The Dark World, it could just be a simple gag. And everyone says, hey, I know that guy. And then they move on. But more insidiously, this was Darren's insidious idea, they could be pulling a Skywalker and trying to appease the old fan base by just shoving the popular character in front of the new property.
I wasn't being quite that extreme. I was more just kind of making the point that it's like, you pointed out that he did get a wonderful capstone, if you will, on his tenure in the role. I kind of feel like...
I'm saying, Will, it works every time.
Every freaking time.
Like,
every time.
This is the thing. The big difference between movies and comic books is that, like, comic books depict characters in a static medium. comic book characters are obviously drawn by different artists and written by different writers, but they are trapped in a moment. So Peter Parker can be Spider-Man from, you know, the mid-60s through to the present into the distant future, and he will still be just out of college, struggling to pay bills, never owning a house, never settling down and having a family outside of stuff like, say, Renew Your Vows or other kind of like spin-off or kind of ancillary media or alternate futures or secondary iterations. The prime version of the character will always be mid-20s, struggling to get a job, struggling to pay the bills, struggling to stay on top of things, and he will never change, he will never grow in any substantial way, and every time a writer comes in and tries to write for him, he will never revert back to form. And like, that's the way that comics work, for better or for worse. There are great writers who can do really, really, really interesting and fascinating things with that. Like Grant Morrison's Batman run, which is a fantastic epic, but is largely built around the tragedy of the fact that, like, Batman will always be Bruce Wayne. It doesn't matter how hard he tries to get away from that. It doesn't matter whether he creates a better version of himself in his son or in Dick Grayson. Because of the market demands, because of the logic of continuity, because of the fans, it will always circle back to Bruce being Batman. And again, that kind of tragic irony of, like, can Bruce be Batman and be happy at the same time? And mining tension from that. But that's how the comic book medium works. Difference with film is that obviously that doesn't apply. Because logically, films are live action, they're actors rather than, you know, drawings on a page, dimensional drawings or iterations. And if you have a long-running continuity like, say, the MCU, so if you don't have that long-running continuity, you can just do what Warner's and Sony's do with Batman and Spider-Man, where, like, as soon as your actor ages out or says he's not interested or dares to raise his voice and ask for a pay rise, like, boom! You've been Alex Garfielded. You've been Andrew Garfielded. It's like, boom! I'm sorry, you've been Val Kilmer. Okay, to be fair, Keaton just said he didn't want to come back. But, you know, that sort of thing happens. But with the MCU, you have a framework of an ongoing continuity. The idea is, and it's a huge selling point for both the universe and for the fans, so you have this buy-in to it, where you have the passage of time, the idea that it's constantly moving forward, and the fact that, like, when you lose an actor like Evans or Downey, you can't recast the roles because that would upset fans. You can maybe get away with it in cases with, say, secondary characters like, say, you know, Don Cheadle replacing Terrence Howard, for example, or even Mark Ruffalo replacing Ed Norton. That sort of stuff you can get away with, but you're never going to get, oh, well, hey, luckily enough, Tom Cruise has arrived, so, hey, look, Tony Stark's back and he just had a facelift. That's the thought we're going with there. And
right.
I think that's a good thing because I think it forces the universe to move forward. It forces the MCU to basically look at, well, if we want to sustain these properties and franchise, and this is the flip side of, like you mentioned when we talked about Wonka, the reason that Wonka's happening is because IP is valuable. And that's, you know, I am not necessarily hugely fond of that as a concept, but let's look at the sunny side of that. Let's look at the bright side. Let's look at the nice side of the, like, of recyclable IPs.
You're asking us not to be cynical dickheads?
I don't. Impossible.
Yeah,
come on,
embrace
Darren.
Let's embrace IP. Let's say continuity is a good thing, right? And let's say that intellectual property and the fact that the Marvel Cinematic Universe will continue being made long after the sun burns out is a great thing. And here is why that is. It's because when you lose those actors and you can't replace them via recasting, God forbid unless the multiverse comes into it for that reason, and I please hope that it doesn't, but let's assume that it doesn't, let's stay positive and optimistic, it forces you to reach into the benches and to bring characters forward. You pointed explicitly to Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Yes.
Which, as you pointed out, draws from comic book arcs, where, say, under Ed Brubaker, Bucky was briefly Captain America. Fantastic run, wholeheartedly recommend it. Under Nick Spencer, Sam was Captain America. Less fantastic run, don't recommend it. But yeah, I mean, Secret Empire.
There are some good moments.
There are some good moments, but there's also like Secret Empire. But like the point is, like, inevitably those comics, I like that. Inevitably they revert back to form, as we mentioned. But with films, you don't have that. So if the MCU keeps running another 10 years, and I think that's highly likely. Like, even if all the shows bomb, even if the next slate of movies don't hit $1 billion, I can still see the MCU working for at least another 10 years. You have a world in which, for 10 years on screen, Captain America is Sam Wilson. He's a black man. You have, for 10 years, a world where Jane Foster is Thor. She's a woman. You have a universe where, for 10 years, Riri Williams is the successor to Iron Man. And she's a young black girl. And if you look at changes in comic books, comic books are a static medium, but they're also a very small medium. The amount of people who actually buy comic books as compared to the amount of people who consume the MCU, who watch movies, who watch television shows, it's minuscule. It doesn't even chart. I mean, again, like, just look at what's happening at DC at the moment, which is tragic and terrible and horrific, but speaks to how volatile the comic book industry is. A lot of the big changes to comics come from outside media. The most important Batman character of the past 30-odd years is Harley Quinn, and she was introduced on a TV show. When you ask people in the street, not people who know comics, not people who read books, if you ask somebody randomly off the street, who's Green Lantern? The first reaction you're going to get is, who's who now? The second reaction you're going to get... the second reaction you're going to get is, he's the black guy, isn't he? He's the black guy on Justice League. And that is not because people have read, like, Hal Jordan comics or because they've read Mosaic.
John Stewart?
It's John Stewart. And
That's his name. All right, I remember the name. All right.
But I mean, he does also share it with another very famous John Stewart as well. But I
remember the name. That's all that matters.
But like, the reason why people associate Green Lantern with John Stewart, and why when it was like Ryan Reynolds is going to be in Green Lantern, everyone's like, what? Wait, what? Wasn't like Green Lantern meant to be a black guy? The reason why that happened is because for like 5-6 years on Justice League Unlimited and on Justice League, Green Lantern was John Stewart.
Right.
And so that becomes hugely influential. And like you can see that trickling back. Stewart, obviously a big part of the character's history and continuity and a big part of like Green Lantern mythos. But if you look at relaunches, he's been positioned more prominently since that cartoon came out, because to mass audiences, to people outside of comic books, to people looking at comic book covers in bookstores who might want to pick it up, that's what Green Lantern looks like. That's who Green Lantern is. And so if we are going to put a spin on, we've got the MCU for the next 10 years and it's going to be amazing. That's my spin on it, is that, okay, fine, we had our 10 years where it was the guys from the 60s, where it was Thor, where it was Cap, where it was Iron Man. They've had tremendous runs. And like, look, you know, Iron Man 2 has its problems. Thor, The Dark World, let's not talk about that. But like, they had a good innings with these sort of things. And now they've been retired. So let's reach into the backbenches and take characters who have never, because of the nature of comic books as a medium that kind of rewards fanish devotion and never really has to move forward because of continuity, bring those characters to the fore, put them in the spotlight, and have them have their pop cultural moment. And my big fear with bringing back Evans, and it, like, even in a small role, even in a jokey role, is that it effectively says, yeah, but look, the real Captain America's back. Or, you remember the real Captain America. As opposed to saying, well, Evans had a really good innings, his time's done, there's a line in the sand under it, let's move forward. And I don't think that insults Evans, I don't think that diminishes Evans, I don't think that diminishes Steve Rogers as a character. I just think it allows the MCU to progress and to move forward and to grow. And that would be my argument in defense. Apologies, I spoke, that's a very long...
You're good.
Sorry.
You have to get that background in there. Yeah, you gotta give the information.
Yeah. That's why we keep doing this, because we like listening to you, Darren.
Sorry.
You know what's crazy for me? Keeping in mind everything Darren just mentioned, because that was a book, and I can't replicate that. I barely speak English, so we're just going to let that rock. You're good, you're good.
Yeah.
I strongly believe in the idea of them kind of picking in the bench and seeing where they can adapt these new characters. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be immediately on the big screen, especially with Disney Plus, because that's one thing where people, it's just going to, there's no way where they can't introduce them, whether it be the smallest of cameos or whether it be a series themselves, and kind of get people situated and then just propel them into the MCU. But my initial thought was more so, because I don't think personally this is going to be a reoccurring role or something where it's like, haha, real Cap is back. Like, no. I think for me, it's going to be one of those jokey things like you had mentioned, Darren. But in case anyone, I'm pretty sure everyone's been on it, a lot of the news that focused around the next possible MCU film is Spider-Man. Spider-Man, in case anyone hasn't noticed, a lot of things, and Darren mentioned it, everyone's hinting at that sort of multiverse. I mean, we've seen where it happened in different mediums. We've seen it in the games, and we've seen it within the actual Sony animated picture. People gravitated towards these things, which makes me think, well, there's been coverage of Tobey Maguire being a part of a film. I wonder what that would be. Not Seabiscuit, Same thing with Andrew Garfield. What the hell is Andrew Garfield doing nowadays? Probably something related to Mr. Spidey Man. You got Charlie Cox, who was originally the Daredevil one. Why was he on set? Yeah. Same thing, they were talking about Jessica Jones. All these things kind of just picking and throwing in. And it kind of links into what Darren's saying where, you know, we have some names, but now it's time to see if they have the rights. What are we going to do with it? But for me, it's weird because Darren hit it too. The comic community, I want to say, are very fickle when they come to certain things. For example, if...
That's a really polite way of putting it.
I don't want to be mean because I would consider myself an avid comic reader. The thing is that, you know, very... It's like, and it's not trying to be political, it's like, I remember prior when Thor... I think they had the adaptation where Thor's no longer Thor and another person stepped in. I believe it was a woman. I didn't read too heavily into the series. Yeah, Jane Foster, like you mentioned. See, look, I'm just going to say like you mentioned the whole time. But I remember saying this to people and they go, well, that's not my Thor. I'm like, I'm sorry, did you write it? Like, what do you mean? It's just a character. And they're like, well, why do they have to change things? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Do you like stale bread? Because that's exactly what they're going to force feed you until you don't give the money. Yeah. So the thing here is it's very interesting because of the fact that I'm on the fence of what's going to end up happening with the MCU. I know that there's going to be, they're taking slow strides that are coming in that, where they're starting to grow. And I think they're going to start going into their backlog. If you ask people who haven't watched or, read the comics of, like, if people don't know who the Eternals are and they're like, what's this? There's a movie about it. Yeah. That's a thing. It's a prime example of kind of just, all right, well, here's some things. And I know it may be smaller or bigger to the comic audience, but for the general audience, they're like, what the hell is this? So, yeah, that's the Eternals. A great name that comic book fans know, but the general audience doesn't necessarily know. And I'm fairly certain that we're going to get to a point where we get these characters that are thrown in and they're going to be expanded. It's going to be something that's great for the universe. But we also have to keep in mind, like, there's going to be these cameos where we're going to see familiar people. I want people to not come across and be the cynical people and be like, no, that's my Cap. No. Don't think too heavy into it. Appreciate what you have. Because I feel like in movies, sometimes, in any medium actually, when we get something that we didn't necessarily know that's like precious and they're given to us, like, we need to accept it for what it is. Accept your gift. Don't be a little bastard, Timmy. And then continue and see what can happen from there. Because if not, then this toxic thing from the comic community can leak over to the films. And quite frankly, I think that's two separate audiences that, they may interchange or they may overlap, but let's keep things the way they are in terms of being polite and also growing and being a better Marvel universe. If not, then we're just going to get Robert Downey Jr. I didn't die! And then it's, we don't want that. I'm so back, baby. Start playing
we shouldn't look a gift Cap in the mouth, is what you're saying. Where it's like, if we get a little Cap cameo, that's fantastic. Like I personally, I always liked it. Or during Sam Wilson's run as Captain America, there were scenes in which he would talk to I believe he was president at the time, Captain Steve Rogers.
Head of
president.
S.H.I.E.L.D., wasn't he? He was head of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Wasn't he president? It doesn't matter because it was comics, man. But like he would have conversations with old man Steve Rogers about like his role. Very similar. Will, I know during a stream we did together, we talked about our love of Miles Morales, and kind of like I do like having that conversation of like, I'm the new guy. Will people accept me? Bringing that meta narrative into the actual character arc. There is something that can be really positive about that. So yeah, okay, I'll be with you here. I will try to hold down my cynicism that if Chris Evans wants to make a cameo, let's just say, hey, look, it's a Chris we like, and move on.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, yeah. To be fair, to defend my cynicism, that's what I was talking about when I mentioned, because Jack mentioned it's like a Luke Skywalker and the Mandalorian. I don't think Cap is going to show up at the climax of Falcon and the Winter Soldier with his shield chopping up droids or anything like that. Although maybe he will. Who knows? We'll talk
If
about
that
when we get to-
happens, then we're fucking done. If Sam Wilson and the Winter Soldier watch Steve Rogers,
On a
Captain
screen,
America,
and
save
just
the
touch-
day on a
and
TV
just rub
screen,
the
I'm
TV screen.
fucking done with everything.
But-
Goddamn Luke
but-
Skywalker, man.
But like this is the thing where I think Will's right. I think that like it should, like, the default reaction to this should be, this is great. It's the best of two. It's the best of both worlds. It's like we're having like a, to mix our kind of like Willy Wonka metaphors, having a chocolate bar and there's a little sprinkling of nuts in there because everybody likes nuts, but you don't want nut bars all the time. If you want, you just eat a nut. If you want to do that, I don't know. I stretch the metaphor. It doesn't really work.
Your
But-
metaphor is falling apart.
okay.
It really is.
It's
It's crumbling. Yeah, it's. Yeah. But my
Oh,
my,
no.
my point is though, like, because we've had like the year that we've had in terms of geek culture, and when I say year, I stretch back to things like, say, The Rise of Skywalker, where whenever older characters have appeared in these narratives, and like including, say, Star Trek Picard or whatever, whenever older characters appear in these narratives that are nominally about young people and about like going forward and forging new identities, the default reaction in these narratives has been to give them space and to say, you should listen to this old guy. He's back from when your dad remembers watching this franchise. He knows what he's talking about. And like, so that's kind of like why I'm reflexively anxious about this. Well,
Gotcha.
I wouldn't be, if this had been 2 or 3 years ago, and Endgame had come out 2 or 3 years before that, I'd be like, yeah, this is great. This is lovely. He's going to do a little small cameo. It'll be a funny little joke. Now I'm reflexively, my back is up and I'm like,
Yeah.
I've seen this before.
You don't want it.
And we don't want it.
Yeah, I don't like where this goes. This is just like priming the road. This is like laying the road for going somewhere I don't want to go.
So let's look to a positive example, like Will had mentioned, Into the Spider-Verse,
Yes,
which,
yes.
not only a fantastic film, but a very financially successful
Yes.
film. Let's focus on that.
So
for
we're
anyone
remaking
listening.
it with Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire.
Don't do that to me. My
Well,
heart.
Sorry.
Or where it's like the
Sorry.
again, it's that meta narrative meets character arc where it really is like, sure, that Into the Spider-Verse has Peter J. Parker or Peter B. Parker.
Peter
sorry.
B. Parker.
Peter B. Parker, which is the Peter Parker that I grew up in. That's the Spider-Man that I grew up in. But the narrative of the film is about Miles finding his own voice and his own personality, jumping off and doing his own thing. That there was a great mentor mentee relationship where the narrative really was about Miles. I still got to have Peter Parker in there and Miles got his own thing. That's the positive example.
And hot take, is that the best Peter Parker that we have had in film? Possibly.
I like Tom Holland.
Oh.
I like the Tom Holland. I think he plays it well. I like both of the MCU Spider-Man films. I still think Homecoming might be the best Spider-Man we've seen.
If I had to rank the Spider-Mans just based off what I got, I'm probably going to go worst with Garfield, follow up with Holland. I love Holland. I really do. But Maguire has a specific place in my heart. I don't know why. I grew up with those movies.
Yeah.
And for me, Miles, just because Miles has always been, not only the POC, not only being a person of color, but just hits it. He nails it for me. It's that sort of like, we're not exactly an adult, because I get tired of hearing the whole, I'm struggling for bills, even though it's me right now. But like, it has, like, it's just the idea of just like kind of coming into your own, that coming age story, and losing your kind of your source, or your father in that case, uncle, whatever, depends on which one you're looking at, and then having that mentor where it's like, I know loss, I know pain. Like when I just finished the Spider-Man remastered game, and I'm just like, yes, I'm so excited to play freaking Miles Morales, because this is gonna be fantastic. So
fucking good.
I know.
Well, no,
I don't know,
and
I'm biased.
If I'm going to choose a Spider-Man movie to rewatch, and this is like, let me rephrase my question here to be: if you say, "Hey, we're watching a Spider-Man movie tonight," for me, if it's not Into the Spider-Verse, I'm slightly disappointed. That is my
Felt that.
favorite Spider-Man movie.
I'll go with
my
two.
Ooh.
I'll go with
You
like
said what? Spider-Man 2?
Into the Spider-Verse or
Spider-Man
Spider-Man 2. Either of those.
Ooh.
Sure. Oh, okay. Sure.
Okay, that's good.
But Darren's specific question was, or I felt the question was, which is your favorite version of Peter
Yeah.
Parker?
Yeah.
Ah,
so,
well
like-
then I'm yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that's why I chose Tom Holland there. But yeah, no, if we're just talking about best movie, Spider-Verse, hands down. I still like the Holland movies over the Tobey Maguire movies, but barely. We
I
don't
feel
count
that.
3, right? We don't count 3. Just
You know
1,
what's
2?
crazy? I was rewatching 3 and I'm like, is this? It's cringy. But they might have hit on some things. You know what I
Okay,
mean?
here's what we're gonna have Will back. We're gonna have Will back on, and we're just gonna do a deep dive into Spider-Man 3. You want to do that?
Sign me up.
Yeah.
Sign me up.
Spider-Man.
Because I do like. There's so much I want to talk about
Yeah.
Spider-Man 3.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, but we
Sorry,
don't
I'm
we don't
not-
have time for it
okay,
today.
yeah,
Yeah, I
I'm
know.
not-
Another day, another day.
Squeeze, pull it back in there, Darren. It's like-
Okay, let's move on because we're
Yeah,
just
sorry.
about at time here, and I really want to get to this next topic as a jumping off point. They have released stills of the new Mortal Kombat movie. We can assume it's a reboot. One, because it doesn't look like a cheapo '90s action movie, and that leads us into one IP once again being the ruling force behind creative decisions is people know Mortal Kombat, let's make a Mortal Kombat movie. And two, the earlier Mortal Kombat movies aren't necessarily the greatest thing in the world, and that led us to an interesting topic. Will, I'm gonna throw it to you here because you're the one who pitched us this idea, and I really do want to get into it. Give us your opening remarks.
So yeah, when the stills released, when Mortal Kombat in general has a place in my heart, but when the stills released, I was just kind of interested because obviously stills don't exactly tell if it's going to be a great film. It doesn't even tell if the action is going to be amazing, but it did bring to my attention certain things. I was just thinking more so like, well, the 95 Mortal Kombat, it's more kid oriented, I would argue. As to, I actually haven't seen the other one, so I can't really say, but I've heard that I've
They go
dodged a
little
bullet.
down in
Yeah.
they-
So, but this poses a very interesting thing because of the fact that this is supposed to be coming out, I believe, if it's not this year, it's 2022, and it's going to be on HBO Max. They're going to release it, I believe, for a certain time frame.
It's April, yeah. It's aimed for April. So it'll be released in cinemas simultaneously and on HBO Max for a month window.
Gotcha. Okay, so thank you for that, Tandalf.
Sorry.
Because cinemas in the States are just up in, at least in New York, it is terrible. You can't go. You have to go to Jersey. And nobody going to Jersey. So, just going off of that, it just brought a very interesting idea. The fact that, is this gonna be something that's good, or is it something that's gonna be bad? And I know that varies depending on how you experience it. How I watch it on a 42-inch rather than an IMAX or Dolby Atmos is going to be a whole different ballgame.
Mm-hmm.
But then this also kind of triggered another idea. Did my train of thought, or has audiences' train of thought, changed due to the pandemic? See, because I'm a fan of films in general. You can give me the crappiest of crappy movie and I'm like, you know what, there's some good in there. Because some of the cinematography, maybe the lighting, maybe an effect. Usually never the story when it's that low, but whatever. So the idea for me was more so like, as the pandemic kind of hit its peaks and valleys and whatnot, I've noticed that I've craved more stories and wanting to enjoy new content. But with a lack of new content to appreciate, that kind of defaults to streaming services or just rewatching older movies. And I had an opportunity to see a couple Netflix originals. Weren't that good. I had an HBO Max original. Well, I wasn't disappointed. But then on the HBO Max, they had a reality TV show that was complete garbage. A bad ripoff of The Bachelor, and I loved it. And it was 12 dates. It's called 12 Dates of Christmas. And it's like hilarious. You like date multiple people in some mansion in Austria. And it's terrible, but I loved it. So that made me think maybe my expectations as an audience has really diminished because I enjoyed something that I knew I previously wouldn't have. And that brings up the idea of, well, as we start to recover, as films start to get a release date, whether it be simultaneously at home or whether it be just strictly on a VOD, has our expectation changed? And this further brings the question, will will companies cut corners because of the fact that they know that what was previously a blockbuster, we don't have to appreciate because we could watch a B-list movie and be like, this was great, 10 out of 10. So that's the question that poses, and I'm curious to see what you and Darren think.
I think like this is an amazing point. It's something that we've talked about here in the podcast before, and general people know about. I always refer to it as the Netflix bloat, which is not a movie not necessarily have to worrying about being so tight to fit within the 90 to 100 hours or 100 hours.
It only feels like 100 hours.
Right? 90 to 100 minutes that like a standard theatrical release would, because it's on Netflix. You can pause it whenever you want. We don't need to worry about fitting in X amount of showings to make our profit back. It can be as long as we want it to be, as long as the editor and director feel like it has to be. And that usually means that movies feel longer. And so I do believe that in general, when a movie is only released to streaming, it is of lesser quality.
True.
That's a general statement. Whether or not that will continue as a trend goes, because there's been plenty of examples. Darren and I talked about the movie Run recently, which is a fantastic Hulu original that is a nice, tight little suspense movie. But maybe that's an outlier. I think... and I've always been of the opinion that any sort of subscription service business model is how little can I put out before customers stop paying. They're not worried about quality anymore. They're worried about meeting the bare minimum of standard. That's me being very, very cynical. And so, yes, I love your premise here that I think in general, we're going to see a quality decline. But also, to counterbalance that, I think we're going to see a creativity increase because there will be more voices being able to make these movies.
Or actually, let's do three claps so you can tell a quick
Three
succession.
claps so I know that's the cut point. Absolutely.
But yes, to go back to what I was saying there a moment ago, this reminds me of a kind of a quote that I wish I could properly cite, because this is not an original me thought, but it's the idea that Netflix is where great directors go to make their worst films. And you can cite any number of examples of this. Think of The Last Thing He Wanted, starring Anne Hathaway and Ben Affleck. Think of like Doug Jones's Mute, for example, which was his passion project, which was maybe not the best film ever. Even Mank, which is a film that I really, really, really like, is arguably one of Fincher's lesser films, perhaps only better than Benjamin Button, but it is at least much better than Benjamin Button. But the idea is that because you have those like constraints lifted,
Rolling Stone.
I know, and his bones are so brittle. But basically, but the idea is basically that you have, because you don't have these restrictions on you, you don't feel the urge to be tight. You're not as concerned about audience experience. You're not as concerned about opening night reviews. You're not as concerned, people will watch it and stream it in their own time, as it were. And kind of, I can kind of see the appeal of that. But to bring it back to what Will said there about pandemic watching, and this is something I find fascinating, is that if you look at like pre-pandemic television, and you look at the great big hits of pre-pandemic television, even back in like 2019, as long ago as that seems, you're looking at shows like, say, Watchmen, for example, which is a weighty exploration of kind of themes of racism in America. It's very hefty, it's very heavy. Things like, the plot against America was a big kind of like talking point before the pandemic hit. Again, another gritty study of fascism rising in America. But then the pandemic hits. And all of a sudden, the only shows that people are talking about are like The Bachelor, or remember Tiger King. Remember when Tiger King came out and everybody in the world watched Tiger King, even though it was like, and precisely because it was this kind of like trashy, low energy, I don't need to engage with a weighty bit of substance here. It's just TV junk food and feed it to me. And by the way, I am not casting aspersions on Tiger King. Give me that TV junk food is what I'm saying here. And like, you had this big kind of push towards kind of escapist entertainment. And I mean, even if you look at the shows that people were binging as well, like the stock of shows like, say, Brooklyn Nine-Nine went way up and obviously went a bit way down, given other things that happened that perhaps kind of cast as kind of Shauna. But things like Parks and Rec, for example, had a huge upsurge. These kind of light, feel-good, I don't have to think too hard about what I'm watching. I just want to check out of all the stuff that's happening out here and go in there for a couple of minutes and not have to worry about it. And I mean, I would argue the same thing's probably true of watching movies at home, particularly when you're streaming, where I would argue there's a fundamental difference between watching a movie in a cinema and watching it at home. I know because I've done a lot of watching at home, and my cinema trips have obviously become a lot rarer in the current climate, and I know that therefore when I'm doing it, it's a lot more of a rarefied atmosphere. But when you're in a cinema, at least if you are, and I mean I don't want to cast aspersions here, if you are a decent human being, you are not like checking your phone, you're not talking to anybody else, you're not insisting that they stop the film while you run out to the bathroom because you forgot to go, or because you need to go get another kind of set of pretzels out there. When you're in the cinema, you are watching a movie on somebody else's schedule. So you have a level of attention and investment that is very much there to see it. You're obviously watching it in an ideal world with a projectionist who knows what he's doing and a sound system that is properly configured. And it's an experience that you're designed to be kind of swept up in. Whereas when you're watching a movie at home, it's everything that Jack pointed out. It's you can pause the movie at your behest. I think when we talked about Wonder Woman, you said, well, we paused Wonder Woman several times because the family kind of had to do other things. That sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
You have kind of jokes about people watching Martin Scorsese's The Irishman as a mini-series instead of like as a film as a whole. And again, if you do that, more power to you. Whatever works for you. I'm not casting judgment or aspersions on you. What I'm saying, though, is that I think that that way of watching a film is fundamentally different to watching a film in a cinema. And I do wonder if this is the flip side of what Will said. Because Will asked basically, has this lowered the standards in terms of what we will accept? In that, like, because we're constantly pausing a movie, or because we're maybe looking at our phone during a movie, or because we're maybe not entirely emotionally there because we're still in a space that we recognize as our home with, let's say, our partners or our children or our dogs or our cats there as well, and we have to attend to them. So that, you know, we're not as thrown into the world. Maybe we have a lower threshold, and we're like, I just want to see something where stuff gets blowed up real good, or I want to see the punchy thing happen, or I want to see the kind of cheesy one-liners happen. And it's like, okay, I don't necessarily want to be immersed completely into the world and have to process and think about it. I just want something where I can just kind of like clock in and out as I go. And I wonder if, I think like, and for me personally as a pandemic viewer, I will freely admit that is a large part of my pandemic viewing. I put my hands up as a bad film critic and say, yes, that is how I've watched a lot of stuff during the pandemic.
How dare you enjoy things?
I mean, not stuff I'm criticizing, not stuff I'm reviewing, but stuff that I'm watching casually. And I do wonder if, like, the flip side of that is that that perhaps explains the extreme reaction to things like, say, Wonder Woman and Tenet, which are movies that I suspect probably played better in big cinemas. And in fact, actually, if you look at, say, the reviews, where the reviews came from, where the positive reviews came from, were typically people who had seen it in big cinemas in Europe or in the rest of the world. And I wonder if, like, that's the flip side of Will's argument, where we are a lot more accepting of certain things at home, but there's also certain aspects missing in terms of the presentation which have affected kind of our response to it. Because you look at things like the anger towards, like you know, I don't think Wonder Woman 1984 is a brilliant film. I don't think it's like one of the greatest movies ever made. I don't think it was one of the best movies of the last year, but, you know, we talked about it. I also don't think that it deserves the level of, like, real anger that it's provoked. Like, a lot of people are just really angry at it. Really angry. Like Wonder Woman 1984 reversed over their dog levels of anger about this movie.
Oh, goodness.
And that kind of... And that kind of stuns me, because I can't understand that. And I wonder if maybe that's kind of the flip side of what Will was saying, where it's like, this was a movie that was designed to be seen on a big screen, in a cinema, with a proper sound system, in that way, without any interruptions, without pausing. Because, let's face it, if you pause Wonder Woman 1984 at any point, and you think about what's happening, it makes no sense whatsoever. The logic is perhaps a little bit loose. I don't think that's a fatal flaw. I think that, like, movies can operate on that logic and work just fine as long as they're good enough. I think Wonder Woman 1984 maybe isn't consistently good enough to do that, but I also don't think it's terrible at that. But, like, that's kind of what I kind of think in terms of that. But Will, what about yourself?
Yeah.
Like, is that a fair flip side? Do you see the other side of that equation? Is that...
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense when you put it into perspective. It's just so weird for me because of the fact that like, I know there's gonna be some sort of people, like, there's different audiences, and I'm one of those people, like, for example, I know people who binge watch TV shows, and I simply can't. I get an episode in, I gotta do something else, my brain's in overdraft, I gotta do something. But with movies, it's usually the opposite. So it's interesting because of the fact that, yeah, we have these options where we can now actually see it in the luxury of our home and pause, rewind, fast forward, so on and so forth. I missed a scene or whatever, like an Easter egg. It's all accepting, and I do know that does impact your viewing experience, especially when you're watching something that's a little long-winded. I don't get where people got mad at like movies like Wonder Woman 1984, because For example, before 1984 came out, I had the 2017 copy digitally owned for years, and I hadn't watched it. And I was like, you know what? It's about time to watch it. I watched the first one, and then the following day I watched the second. And I was like, one's clearly a superior product, but also I didn't see it in cinemas. I feel like if I was in a different environment, that would make a difference. So it's very clear to see that there's going to be people on both sides of the fence. I'm hoping that this won't stop the growth. I'm hoping because as Netflix has become right about now the HBO of, if one would say, of their home streaming services, well, even though they have Max, like that's the thing. That's what people revert to. Most people say, what are we watching on Netflix tonight? Like that's just that. So because that's become the end all be all. And granted, even before the pandemic, there was a ton of crap that nobody needed to see. But if you like it, you like it. And there's no shame in liking what you like. But I guess my fear was more so is because of the fact that now this is my AMC or Regal or whatever cinema you go to. Have my standards drastically changed? I hope it didn't, because when I seen Wonder Woman, I felt general excitement. And I felt like I wanted to see it in movie theaters. I want to say the same for Tenet, but I know I'm gonna confused when I watch Tenet. I saw something on Reddit that was explaining the timeline, and I was like, I'm gonna need a PhD to figure this one out.
Damn it! Shouldn't have gone to film studies. That was my mistake. I should have gone into physics and then film studies.
Exactly. No, I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is barrier to entry, and like some of the things that Darren was touching on here, where it's like you have to schedule a time to go see a movie. Like it's on their schedule. You have to pay someone money to walk into a movie theater. Like, okay, so now because the barrier of entry is a little bit higher, the status of this is a little more important, so I need to take it seriously. Hopefully you're taking it seriously if you're paying money to see a movie. All you people on your cell phones while watching a movie.
Just IMDb who's the actor.
Which, by the way, I do constantly when I'm watching movies at home, which is a bad way to watch a movie. But because those barriers to entry aren't here or aren't directly in front of you at home, because you can pause it, it's this is something like that I've mentioned. I don't know if I've ever mentioned here. It's the difference between a mixtape and a rap album, where one is usually a free product that you have very low expectations for, so maybe you don't take it as seriously. But if you pay for an album, it means something. Therefore, it should rise to that level. I'm looking at you, Chance. Not happy with you.
Oh, goodness gracious.
I know. I've got some hot takes on hip hop. Which is terrible. But the point is, I feel like expectations are lower. Also, I feel like that's a natural byproduct of the way we consume anything. If you happen across something for free because expectations are low and they are exceeded, that's a good thing. If expectations are high, either because of who made the movie or because of how much time you're putting into watching it or how much money you're going to pay it. And even if they're exceeded, it won't be as good as that free thing that exceeded expectations, if I said that correctly.
I mean, to bring it full circle, it's worth noting that, like, before this podcast began, I think Will alluded to it earlier as well, both Will and I watched Lockdown, which is the Doug Liman, Stephen Knight kind of, like, pandemic film thriller in London, starring Anne Hathaway and Chiwetel Ejiofor. And, this got terrible reviews. Everyone kind of said, what the hell are you doing? This is the worst thing in the history of cinema. And again, I'm willing to concede that it might have been lowered expectations, but I watched it and I was like, this isn't the worst thing in the history of cinema. I was lied to. And like I can see, like there are problems with it. Like it's full of movie smart people who illustrate how smart they are because they're surrounded by movie dumb people who don't know about things and can be impressed by long-winded poetry, and who are so dumb that when characters say something, their response isn't to say, yeah, no, I get the reference, but why are you saying it in this context? Because that's just weird and not how people interact. Instead, movie dumb people are like, no, what is a Valkyrie? Tell us about a Valkyrie and explain its relevance to this scene. But outside of stuff like that, I quite enjoyed it because it was kind of playful, it was a little goofy, it was let's make a film under lockdown conditions and see if we can construct one in that way. It allows Anne Hathaway to do that thing that Anne Hathaway is very good at, which is playing that particular neurotic style of energy. That, again, either you like it or you don't. I happen to quite like it and think Anne Hathaway's good at it. And Ejiofor is, for my money, one of the most underrated actors of his generation. In large part,
1,000%.
In large part because he doesn't seem to have taken the roles or have been offered the roles. I don't know what happened after 12 Years a Slave, but he just kind of dropped off the map, and I presume he went into theater and other places like that, but he's phenomenal. And even just watching him play a movie, and one of the most irritating movie smart people I have ever seen. He is so good that I'm like, okay, fine, movie, you get a pass on this.
But if you
Yes.
paid $12
Yes.
and had to like set
A date and,
aside 3 hours of your day to, you know, drive there, go see it, drive back, would you have these feelings of, yeah, it was all right, or would now that movie suck as bad as Rotten Tomatoes says it
Yeah,
does?
no, I think it's a very valid question.
That's the
I always have the standard option of, if I saw this movie in theaters, would I enjoy it? And it didn't matter what, if it was a B movie or below. And if I enjoy it, at that point, I'm just like, you know what? Honestly, and it happens a lot with smaller films. I'm like, these critics, like, I'm not opposed to anybody giving criticism. I'm just like, I don't get why they're so harsh. And I don't understand why people are so angry. But quite frankly, like, you know,
a lot of people are
again,
very angry.
yeah.
But I mean,
again,
I think we know why people are angry, and I don't think it's anything to do with the films. If we're being entirely
yeah.
Are
He's
you,
you're
are you just pointing to
I'm
the
just,
world in
just
general?
looking around.
This box that I'm in.
Right? No, I think like I think overall it's a really interesting concept, and I think like the takeaway for anyone listening here is like understand that each thing that you're watching, be it in a theater, be it you know, on Netflix or a streaming service, is its own individual piece of art. And like Will said, if you're enjoying watching it, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
Whether it be The Bachelor, Joe Exotic, or Mike,
Spider-Man 3?
Yeah.
or Spider-Man 3.
The Irishman repurposes a series of Vine videos.
I would, you know what? I'd probably watch that.
Yeah.
All right, but we are running out of time here, so I have to wrap this up. Though I thought that was a wonderful podcast. Will, thank you so much for
Thank you
joining
for
us.
having me. It's
we
a
will
pleasure.
definitely have you back for a complete Spider-Man 3 breakdown,
Yes.
which is something that I've been wanting to do for a while. But in any case, thanks everyone for watching and or listening to this. Once again, I've been Jack Packer.
I've been Darren Mooney.
And I've been Will Cruz.
Boom, baby.
Jazz hands.
Oh,
Don't know if you
yes,
see him, but
hey.
bye, jazz heads.